Well, hello, welcome once again to Pale Blooms and Beyond. Thank you for joining us today. And if you do like the programming that you see here and the artists and musicians on this show, please be sure and hit the like button below and also subscribe to the channel. Stephen Cohn is an American musician and composer of concert and film music. He began his musical journey as part of the folk band, The Pleasure Fair. The group included Robb Royer, future founding member of the band Bread. A 1966 single was issued under the name The Rainy Day People, and the following year a full-length album attributed to the Pleasure Fair. In 1973, Stephen would release an eponymous solo album on Motown Records. Later on, Mr. Cohn would leave the pop music scene and devote his time studying music theory, which ultimately led to his creating his own compositions. For over 50 years, Stephen has composed music for a variety of concerts, recordings, and film. His scores have been included in many productions and feature films, and his works have been performed and recorded by orchestras and ensembles in the US and Europe. Well, welcome, Stephen.
Hello, Greg. It's good to meet you.
Good to meet you, and thank you for doing this, taking time out of your schedule to meet. Well, take us back to the beginning.
I think the thing that started it all is kind of interesting. I went to two colleges. I spent 3 years at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington, as a music major. And then I had an interest in folk music that led to a very deep interest in the guitar. And after my third year at Whitman, I started studying guitar with the Romero family.
Okay.
And so rather than go back to Whitman, I stayed in Los Angeles so that I could continue studying with the Romero family, and then ended up being the first person at Cal State Northridge to give a senior recital on the classical guitar.
Okay.
And that's of historical interest because that's how Robb Royer found me. He had the idea of having a singing group that was accompanied by a classical guitarist and a jazz guitarist.
Okay.
And so I got together with them, and my life changed from sitting in a room by myself for 8 hours a day suddenly to working with other people.
Okay.
And I was very drawn to that, as well as the fact that the other members of this group, Tim Hallinan, Robb Royer, and Michelle Cochran, were all very interesting, charismatic, vital people.
Right.
So I started working with them as a guitar accompanist, and I was surrounded by other people who were writing songs. The only composition I had done up to that point in my life was in a composition class in college. So while I was working with this group that became the Pleasure Fair, I was also playing in a group that was headed by a woman named Elizabeth Waldo, who had a band that played ancient Aztec music as she imagined it.
Okay.
So
That's interesting.
I was not particularly fascinated with this group, but I was getting paid a very small amount of money to rehearse and perform with them. So one day in the middle of an Elizabeth Waldo rehearsal, I suddenly got the idea for a bossa nova song.
All right.
And my mind went completely absent from the rehearsal, and I sat there and I wrote this song. that was the beginning. That was the first song I wrote. Then in working with the Pleasure Fair, I began writing songs with Tim and Rob.
Okay.
And I was also ended up doing vocal arrangements for the group because I was the one that had the background.
Oh, okay. Now
The-
that musical gene went through your family too. Both of your parents were musically inclined.
yeah, good point. My sister ended up being a PhD in flute from Juilliard and USC.
Yeah.
My mother was a violinist and a dancer. My dad was an attorney who defended people in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee. He was chief counsel for the Screenwriters Guild. But in his soul, he was a composer, and he spent every moment of his spare time passionately writing chamber music. So I think, I was exposed to this while I was still in the womb. I think before I was even
Yeah.
born, I had this. So yeah, I think it was just part of my genes that were there and we're just waiting for the right catalyst, to bring it to the surface.
What was the first instrument you learned to play?
I played the clarinet when I was in grammar school, played in the orchestra and so
Oh,
forth.
did you like that? Did you like playing that clarinet?
No,
No.
no. I think the first writing I did, I guess literally, was in composition class in college, but the first self-inspired compositions were the songwriting I did during that first period with Pleasure Fair.
Okay. Well, talk about how you were the last member to join, right? Weren't the other three in the
Yes,
band?
yeah, Michelle and Tim and Rob had been together for a while.
Okay. And then how did you jump on board? What were the circumstances?
Well, Rob just invited me and a jazz guitarist named Mike. I can't think of his last name now, but anyway, he just invited us both to a rehearsal, and we started, working at accompaniments for the Pleasure Fair. Mike turned out not to be interested in the whole idea, but I was. So
Okay. Do you
I, I
remember do you remember any of the other names besides the Pleasure Fair that the band
yeah,
went by?
yeah. Well, there was the Rainy Day People, as you
Uh-huh.
mentioned.
Uh-huh.
There was We Three. That was before I joined the group. There may have been others that I don't recall, but the Pleasure Fair was the one that stuck because that's the one we used when we recorded for MCA.
Okay, okay.
Uh,
Well, why was the single Junior Executive released under the moniker The Rainy Day People? Why was it?
yeah, so we had a manager, excuse me,
Mhm,
named Arnie Mills,
mhm. Well,
and he was searching for recording opportunities and performance opportunities for us. And he hooked us up with a very successful, at the time, producer named Snuff Garrett.
all right, yes.
And Snuff Garrett, this was really a weird little historical quirk. Snuff Garrett was connected with Leon Russell.
Right, right.
Leon Russell had a house in the Hollywood Hills, and it was a large place, and he was importing musicians from Nashville and Memphis, and they would stay in his house while they got themselves established or tried to get themselves established. And the toll for them for this uh, benefit that Leon was bestowing on them was to play in all the recording sessions he did there. So we
Oh,
were sent up there and we worked with one of his producers there, and we made a few singles. So Junior Executive was one of them.
Okay. And it was released on Hanna-Barbera.
It was released on Hanna-Barbera. I'm not sure exactly how the mechanics of that, something that Arnie Mills and Snuff Garrett put together.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. Well,
Yeah.
do you recall how the band was signed to Uni Records?
Dave Pell was the president of Uni Records at that time. And I guess he was a friend or an acquaintance of Arnie Mills. And he sent us over there. We did a live audition, and they decided to sign us.
They liked what they heard. Okay.
Yeah.
The early seeds of bread were being sown.
Yeah.
David Gates arranged and conducted the
Right.
1967.
Right. So Dave Pell hired David Gates to work with us. And trying to think of how to be diplomatic here.
Okay.
David was a gifted guitarist, singer, songwriter. There's no question about that. But he really did not get us.
Yeah.
And he did a very kind of ballpark standard, hire a bunch of good studio musicians, throw us in there, and made an album that did not capture any of what we really had to offer, the uniqueness of what he did, however. So one of the things that I brought to this situation was, because of my classical guitar background, when it came to songwriting, I had a kind of unique way of using the guitar, of using certain kinds of voicings that an electric guitarist or a folk guitarist wouldn't think about. Because, the classical guitar gets you into using both your right and left hand into ways that you would not do as a rock guitarist or a folk guitarist, So the chord voicings and so forth were, rather unique.
Yes.
And David Gates studied that, which he needed to do. He needed to study it in order to write arrangements based on what we were doing and produce it. But those voicings and that guitar style really influenced David's own music.
Yes.
So, and you will hear it in his early hits, like "Make It With You." You will hear that kind of guitar. I'm not claiming anything of David's work other than to say that I think he was profoundly influenced by his work with us.
With you guys, yes.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised to hear you say that he was maybe not the right producer for your music, and he didn't really bring it out, the way it probably should have been presented or recorded. But again, it is what it is. At the time, on the album itself, there were a few covers, but the majority of the songs were penned by you, Rob, and Tim.
Right.
And then there's the song "Talk," which was written by you. And who is D. Gear?
Donald Gare was
Gear.
a close friend of Tim's,
Okay.
Who is no longer with us, unfortunately.
Okay.
Mostly after the Pleasure Fair broke up, Donald Gare and I had a period where we were under contract to Copland and Rubin Company to write songs. Some things historically out of sync there, because Donald Gare and I did not start working together until long after, well, not long, but quite a while after that album was made.
Okay.
So I don't think Don and I wrote that song. I think that was something from Herman and the Hermits, if I'm not
Okay.
mistaken.
Okay. Okay. Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
I mean, you know, there you go. You can't always believe everything you read right on the
yeah, yeah,
internet, especially right. Uh, well, the song "Morning Glory Days" did
yeah,
chart on the Billboard singles chart.
yeah,
It did what, number 34 on the Bubbling Under. So that's
yeah.
that is at least something there from the album.
The whole idea of psychedelically influenced music was very big, so they leaped on that title, as a place to start.
Right, right. Were you and the band was briefly in an episode of Ironside. Do you recall that?
Just vaguely. I mean, we got hired to do this gig, and we were sitting in a vocal booth in a recording studio doing our thing while some much more important action was taking place in another part of the studio. That's pretty much all I remember, except I still get occasional royalty checks for
Right, right. Oh, what was the the what was that? The zombies were in a movie, Bunny Lake is Missing.
ah,
Do you remember that? And they were briefly, like, similar to yours, just very briefly. It was in a bar, and they were on the TV up in the corner, and if you blinked, you missed it, that kind
yeah,
of thing. So very interesting how
yeah,
the
we were just a prop actually.
was it? Well, well, I do like the 1968 single, "I'm Gonna Have to Let You Go." Of the material from that period, I have to say I really enjoyed that one. Had the
So
band?
there's
Oh, go ahead. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
well, there's an interesting story about that song.
Okay.
Uh, None of us were particularly happy with the album. And a while after it was released, Michelle called a meeting of the group, which met in my little apartment in the hills above the Hollywood freeway,
Yeah.
to tell us that she was quitting. She was quitting the band. Um, and so uh, a little while after that, I started that song, "I'm Gonna Have to Let You Go." And I finished it with Tim and Rob. And then we made the single. And I don't even remember whether David Gates produced that or not. But anyway, that was the last thing we did together.
Okay, that was the last.
Yeah.
By the time it was released, had you already broken up, or were you still together?
Yes. Yeah,
Okay.
we had, and we that was not Michelle. There was a different woman named Michelle sang that song.
Okay.
Yeah,
I did notice the difference in the voice. Yes.
yeah,
Yeah, I did. Definitely. Definitely. Well, I mentioned earlier that Rob went on to form Bread.
right.
What what did you and the other members do at that point?
So, you want like in the short term or in the long term?
Both, both. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Well, at that point, everything in my life came to an end at the same time. I had a 3-year relationship with a woman who was really the first real love of my life. We broke up, and the pleasure fair broke up. And I moved from my Hollywood apartment down to a duplex on Brooks Avenue in Venice.
Okay.
Uh, and that was the beginning of, I think of that as the beginning of the time when I really intentionally was working on developing myself as a serious artist. So I had like a 3-year period there during which I did all of my 60s style experimentation, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
uh, and was working on writing songs mostly by myself, some with a few other people. But those were the songs that ended up being on my Motown album. That's another story to get into. Robb was then working on the beginnings of Bread with David Gates and a guy named Jimmy Griffin. And Michelle went on the dating game and ended up marrying uh, Murray Roman, who was a well-known at the time comedian and writer. That she went on the dating game. She was the prize that everybody was working for, and Murray Roman won, and they went on a world tour. And then when they came back, they got married. She was with. This starts the beginning of another long story, so I don't know if I should
Well,
be.
well, that's good. That was one of a successful dating game
Yeah,
outcomes. Yeah.
yeah.
Wow. So they did. Is that one still out there on YouTube? I wonder if it's out that
I
episode.
don't know. It's an interesting question. I
Yeah,
never
that
been
would
able
be
to find that.
interesting to find out about that. Well, I did want to talk because you mentioned it, the Motown album.
Yeah,
Uh, I think I did remember hearing or reading about how Motown had moved out to LA to try to kind of branch out and not just to be,
exactly.
strictly, black or, African American music, soul and R&B, and to try to kind of grow and move some, facilities out there. So, is that how you heard about Motown, or how did you come into?
So, okay, so toward the end of my Venice period, I met Tom and Beverly, who were Tom Driscoll was one of the owners of the Driscoll strawberry fortune in California.
Oh, okay.
And he formed a production company along with a couple of other people. One of them was a disc jockey from San Diego named Ron Jacobs. And the other one was a guy who had a Toyota dealership, and I can't remember his name. But anyway, they formed a production company called Watermark Incorporated. Watermark had a Toyota dealership. They started American Top 40 radio,
Oh,
which the last I heard was still going in some markets.
yeah.
And then they had a recording studio that was in the home of Cyrus Faryar. And that, oh boy, there's so many side stories here. You have to kind of guide me as to what's of interest and what's not. Anyway, I signed with them,
Mhm.
and I spent close to a year between the signing with them and learning all the social rituals that were going on with them, and then recording. I think I recorded 14 of my own songs for an album. And then, just as I was almost finished mixing everything down, Watermark went out of business. They just went bankrupt or went broke. And they left me. I had been existing on a songwriter's salary they were paying me. Um, they went out of business. They left me on the street basically with my almost completed master. I
Um,
was living in Laurel Canyon at the time with my first wife, Pepper.
okay.
Uh, and so I started shopping it around, which is an arduous task. I think anybody will tell you who's done this. But anyway, I guess I ended up at Motown at just the right time when they were looking to break into the white pop market, having moved
Right.
out here and
Right.
so forth. And my father, who was an attorney, as I mentioned, he spent a year trying to complete the contract. You know, they made an offer and then trying to get them to complete it and so forth was really something. But anyway, it finally was completed. And then I went back in the studio and did some finishing work on that. And that was the Motown album.
Yeah, yeah. I wonder at the time how the audience, I mean, how fans and music fans responded to that, because traditionally Motown, was the soul and R&B. And do you think that that helped you or hurt you being on Motown?
I think it did not help me. I think that this was not their area of expertise, how to deal with a white sort of personal singer-songwriter type
Singer-songwriter. Right,
album.
right,
Just was not their thing particularly.
right.
And of
Well,
course, I take responsibility for what was on the album. That's not their fault. They did leave me alone and let me do my thing. Uh, but anyway, that
yeah.
was
Well,
go
I,
ahead.
I know I was going to say I wanted to mention a few of the tracks that I enjoyed listening to the
Oh,
yeah, and see your memories of the songs,
yeah.
maybe inspiration or stories behind the songs. American Cheese.
Yeah.
To me, that one kind of has a Randy Newman kind of vibe.
Yeah. Yeah. I see what you mean. Yeah, that's one of the ones that I still like after all this time.
Uh,
And that was one was not released as a single, but I was on the Midnight Special,
oh, right,
and
right.
they wanted to do American Cheese, so I did perform that one live on TV sometime
Oh,
later.
did you really? I was going to ask you about that. Any TV appearances? Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
That would be neat to unearth that video too if it was out there. So I used to watch, yeah, Midnight Special all the time.
Uh,
Growing up, yeah, yeah. Um, Natural Gas. I like the lyrics in that.
ah, interesting.
Yeah, the finest way to fly. Yeah, yeah.
I still like it too, and I wonder now, and maybe even wondered then, whether the references were a little too much of the time for anybody else to kind of get the metaphor, the analogy that I was
Right,
making.
right. Well, I get it. So it's traveled well.
Yes.
I understand it. uh, and then I think I found a way. I think that's one of my favorites on the album.
Uh-huh.
Is that a
Ah,
is that an oboe in there? You remember
was that
an
oh,
oboe? Oboe?
yes, yes.
Okay, that's one of my favorite instruments. I love the oboe. Yeah,
Yeah, me too.
yeah, yeah.
I just wrote some chamber music recently using the English horn, which is
Yes,
that's sort of an alto oboe.
right,
Uh,
right. I love it when it's done right. But it did come across really nicely in that one, in that
Thank
track,
you.
that one. And then another one, One Good Reason, another one that I really like.
That's one, if anything should have been the single release, I think that
Okay,
one should have been. And that song I think could have done okay any other period as well. I should mention, by the way, that the arrangements on that album were done with the help of a very old friend of mine, Dan Neufeld. And Dan Neufeld's brother, John, was one of the leading studio clarinetists of the period, and he ended up being one of John Williams' orchestrators.
Oh, is that right?
Orchestrated a lot of John Williams' music.
Oh, I love John Williams music.
Yeah.
It's film music. Wonderful, wonderful. Yes. Well, and then another track, it's hard for me to decide between I Think I Found a Way and Not Enough People Who Care.
Ah,
Nice ballad. And again, it's very apropos today,
ah,
very much. You know, I feel
thank,
that. I think a lot of people feel that.
yeah. Well, that's nice that you were drawn to the stuff, some of the stuff I think of as the most personal
Yes,
stuff on the
that
album. That's nice.
those are the songs that I have an affinity for, really. Yeah. They kind of touch something in here too. Uh, well, do you recall at the time what the reaction was? Were there any writings about it, critics or anything at the time?
Uh, the reactions were not great. We uh, we did a tour of the United States. I did some TV appearances. The sales were not great, you know. Um, I don't remember any reviews at the moment.
Okay.
Maybe you know more about that.
No, no. Well, when did you start moving in the direction of string quartets?
Yeah, so first of all, following that album,
Yes, fill in the gap.
there were Motown asked me to record 4 more songs, which I did, and then they had a change of the person who was head of A&R, and he decided not to do any more. So, and I had spent a lot of years songwriting at that point, and I had quite a number of songs recorded between my own and the Pleasure Fair and some stuff for A&M Records, so forth. There were quite a number of recordings. And I felt really kind of burned out on dealing with the record business. I I began a master class at UCLA in film scoring
Oh, okay.
with a man named Walter Scharf. Walter was somebody who, it was an older man. It was in his, I think, late 70s when I started studying with him, which went on for 3 years. And he had been around since the first sound films. So he was there when the art of film scoring began to be developed in in the first sound film. So he brought a great deal of wisdom to the whole concept of what film scoring was about, even though he was not a particularly verbal person, but he was able to communicate a lot. And for the first stuff that I wrote for him, he saw me as a classical composer and encouraged me, to do more of that.
Okay.
So there was a period there where I wrote a couple of film scores, a couple of TV documentaries. I won an Emmy for one of the documentaries that I scored called Dying with Dignity.
With dignity. Right.
And then I guess it was just kind of a natural progression that I started experimenting with, classical instrumental music. I wrote a woodwind quintet. I wrote a orchestral piece. And then one of the very first things I wrote was a string quartet, which I named Eye of Chaos,
Yes.
because I was really into the new physics, and I was studying quantum physics and chaos theory. So I wrote this piece, and I was very ambitious, and I had started attending Monday evening concerts at the Bing Theater at the LA County Art Museum. And I attended a concert that was being given by the Arditi Quartet, who were really heroes of the new music world. The Arditi Quartet and the Kronos Quartet were like the two
Yes.
leading string quartets and well-known luminaries, of the new music world.
Right.
So I was very naive about all the hierarchies and things people go through to getting music to people like that. And I heard the Arditi's concert. I was completely amazed with them, which most people were, because they're really quite an awesome ensemble. And after the concert, I just walked up to Irvin Arditi and I said, I wrote a string quartet. Can I send it to you? And I sent it to him. And I think it was 4 or 5 months later, I got a phone call from him from London saying he wanted to premiere the piece.
Is that right?
Yeah, so
Yeah.
that was the beginning of that.
Had you, what, before you said 4 or 5 months, had you started to think that maybe this won't happen?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, by
Well,
that.
I always carry that around. Maybe
Yeah.
this. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I don't know at what point I would have said, well, he's not going to respond, but at least he did. At least he did, like you said.
Yeah.
And well, that's a good start right there.
Yeah.
Did you also branched out into chamber orchestra works as well, with and without choirs?
Say that again, the last thing.
Oh, with choirs and without choirs.
Oh yeah. 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 Well, first of all, the Arditi Quartet, was a very well known ensemble. So the word of my getting a premiere with them uh, carried me into a lot of possibilities that would not have happened otherwise. One of them was a woman composer, Joanna Bruzdovich, who is a Polish woman living in the hills of southern France. Invited me to a festival in the city of Sarre, south of France.
Okay.
So all of this kind of stuff has kind of started a momentum. And I got recommended by an organization in New York that this is where the choral music started, was recommended for a commission for them. They were putting together a repertoire of music that was spiritual but not religious, which is something else that fit my background well, because when I was living in Venice and attempting to develop myself as a serious artist, one of the things I did was to explore, I wanted to find the source of creativity. So I started exploring Eastern philosophy, because they're focused on consciousness. So I thought that was a good place to go. So I had somewhat of a background in spiritual information, spiritual books, and so forth.
Let me ask you before you, since
Yeah.
you're from out there, did you follow Alan Watts?
I read a number of things that he wrote, mostly quotes that I would see by him in other places. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, I've seen several of his videos on YouTube, and I'd heard about him a long time ago, but just recently really started watching those, and
Uh-huh.
really get a lot out of them. Yeah, really, really
So
nice.
it still rings true for you.
Yes.
So as
And
far as a chamber orchestra, uh, let me see if I can track down where this one started. Oh, um, somebody that I was dating was connected with a company on the East Coast called At Peace Media, who specialized in music for meditation. So I did an album. She recommended me. I did an album of mostly electronically generated meditation music. And then around that time, um, I did orchestrations for another composer, Jonathan May, who was writing music for a theme park, Medieval Times, it was
is
called.
that right? We have one here.
Aha. It's probably the same one. Where are you?
Outside of Dallas, we have one here in Dallas.
Oh, yeah. Well, they have chapters, in
Yes,
various places in the country.
yes.
So anyway, and you've probably heard his music then. They hired him to do, it was like an hour and a half of music for this show. And he was able to do this with big orchestra and chorus because he discovered recording in Prague, where you can hire an orchestra for, a fifth or a tenth of what it costs to do it in Los Angeles.
Right.
So he hired me to do orchestrations. I went with him to Prague and worked there. And then I got the idea that I could produce an album of music there for At Peace Media. And they got the idea then of having me do an album based on American folk music for mothers and children to listen together. So they had the album title was Two Together. So that's where I did an album that was composed of several different small chamber ensembles and several pieces for a small orchestra.
Okay. Is that the one that you won the Parents Award for?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. When you mentioned that,
Yeah.
for the children, yes. Uh, Parents' Choice Gold Award. That's what I was.
Right.
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 Right. Okay. Okay. So yeah, like you said, once you got in good with this, a community, uh, you were, you started getting that momentum, and other people noticed and started making more connections and picking up more work.
Right.
Right. So that's a good thing to put on your list.
And then also, I started attending concerts in Los Angeles where new music was being performed.
Yeah.
And up to the time of COVID, there were a number of very active new music organizations that were doing a lot of stuff in LA. A lot of that never came back after COVID, but I started. Oh, this is an important chapter and related to what I'm saying. There's an organization in Los Angeles called the Shumei Arts Council that is based on a Japanese religion, actually, or philosophy called Shumei. And one of the basic principles, the basic principle is uh, illuminating people's hearts and minds through art.
Like that. Yeah.
So they give concerts regularly. They had a yearly concert that featured the best young chamber musicians in Los Angeles, which meant the best people from UCLA, USC, and Colburn, basically. And I had a series with them starting in 2008 that ran, so it was like up through 2015. Every year they would commission me to write a chamber piece and then produce a concert with them featuring the the best musicians around. And then we just did another one recently, which will be the last of the series.
Okay, okay. Well, you've also been a composer in residence at the International Encounters of Catalonia in France. Uh, Tell the viewers, what does it entail to be a composer in residence?
Well, it really means just showing up and having some of your music played there, and being open to talking about whatever people find interesting about your music, or about, what's, for me, a lot of it is what's the difference between being a concert music and a film music composer, because
Right,
I've
right.
done some of both.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you about the film music. I've talked to a few other musicians that went into that area too. It must be fascinating to have that germination, the idea, the concept of the music, and then completing the music, and then seeing it come to life in a movie, hear your music as it is in the movie. That must be very interesting.
Well, it's both exciting and often a little disappointing, because
Okay.
one of the most important things that somebody who thinks they're interested in film composing needs to understand is that when one is studying classical music, you're exposed to this historical concept of a composer being a strong, solitary individual who sits in a room by himself, comes up with something that will contribute to the state of the art of music. In other words, do something original and unique.
Yeah.
And nobody would mess with that. Nobody would, try to tamper with somebody's uniqueness in doing something like that. Film is just the opposite. The composer is in charge of the musical part of a director's vision for a film, and therefore is very much subject to not necessarily creating something that advances the state of the art at all, but rather finding the exact tone and style to enhance the story and the characters and the development of the characters and the story. So it often one really has to have one's ego in check,
Right.
and have that kind of vision to be able to watch where your mind is going, and be ready to have your masterpiece that you just labored over,
Yeah.
have it, say nope, or have it hacked into pieces and using hunks of it here or there, and most commonly just having it turned down so low when it's being used that you don't really hear all of what the composer would intend to be heard. And on the other hand, that's, this is me being the cynical composer. The other part of it is a chance to be a part of something very exciting and wonderful and powerful. So it's a mixed thing. It's not an easy job.
Right. I can see what you're saying there. Yeah. Hadn't really thought about it that way, but yeah, being subject to what the director or the movie, the subject matter, and having to yeah, kind of work along their restrictions and what they're trying to, instead of what you're you composed the music for to begin with. Yeah.
Yeah, so it may mean that some very familiar style of writing is exactly what's needed to create the flavor, of that scene, rather than doing something really unique and
Right.
individualistic.
Right. Right. Yeah. You do have to keep your ego in check. You're very, very much so. Well, are there, as mentioned in the intro, your concert works have been performed recorded by orchestras and ensembles, not only in the US, but in Europe as well. So, been performed quite a few places.
Yeah.
That's got to be rewarding to you.
Yeah, it is rewarding to get to have the work get around in various places. And we're living in an age when whatever you do sticks around for a long time and is apt to show up in places that you didn't expect.
Right.
Uh,
Just like your music, with the Pleasure Fair and your solo album, finding new audiences, and
yes.
I ran across them. So there are other fans out there, and that's the good thing about having recordings too, that and with the internet. I was going to ask you, are there, looking back, any types of ensembles or groups that you particularly enjoyed working with?
Well, currently and for the last few years, I've enjoyed writing for, smallish chamber ensembles. Um, the string quartet, is an example, although there have been many, many string quartets written, and one has Beethoven breathing down their neck when you write string quartet. But I recently, decided that I wanted to write some stuff for the English horn because I particularly like the sound. And I discovered after I got into it that there was a dearth of good chamber music for English horn. And this enabled me to connect with a couple of really extraordinary English horn players who were very interested in finding new music for the English horn. So it turned out to be both a musical and a practical choice.
Right, right.
It's resulted in getting a recent performance with members of the Philadelphia Orchestra,
Oh, is that right?
piece for English horn, violin, and cello.
Okay. We'll talk about the difficulties or the logistics in dealing with, a smaller, you know, three-piece or a quartet, and then dealing with a whole orchestra.
You mean both creative problems and or
And
business problems?
synchronizing and everyone's, being together.
You're really speaking about music then,
Yes.
rather than politics or
Yes, music.
practicality. Yeah.
Music.
Well, when you have a small ensemble, there's a kind of a purity about it. Because when you have a big orchestra, you have a thickness of texture. You have the advantage of having a lot of power sonically. When you have a small ensemble, it's a very sensitive, intimate group of musicians in which every idea played by each instrument is heard very clearly,
Yes.
So it's like a very intimate conversation in which each voice plays an important part, and each voice is exposed, as against in an orchestra where you have these big, thick textures. So you can make these beautiful, lush colors that can just hypnotize a listener rather than focusing them more specifically on what's being said.
The bigger picture versus yes, I can.
Yeah, yeah.
And maybe one or two of the instruments can make a mistake and it's not picked up in a larger orchestra.
Yeah, and that's what I mean by exposed, you know.
Right.
Everything that happens is very exposed.
You're right.
A single note when you're writing counterpoint for two or three instruments is very important. It can really just
Very noticeable.
take your concentration away from the flow, you know, where a single note in a big mass of thick texture may not be that noticeable.
Yeah, that's interesting. I was going to ask you too, Stephen,
Yeah.
about any favorite concert halls, as well as countries and audiences that you've performed in front of.
Interesting. Ah, well, one of my favorite concert halls is one that's not easily accessible, although it's not impossible. The Shumei Arts Council has a Japanese modern auditorium in Pasadena, which is both visually and acoustically just really beautiful. And it holds about 350 people, but the acoustics there are quite wonderful. I've had, you know, performances there that were very satisfying. I, of course, like Disney Hall. Um, I like Bing Theater and the LA County Art Museum.
What about in cathedrals or churches performing there? The acoustics and some of those are really nice. Yeah.
Yeah. When the Arditi recorded Eye of Chaos, the Arditi Quartet, that's kind of an interesting story. They recorded it in a church in Tooting, which is on the outskirts of London. It's a suburb.
Okay.
And they liked it because it has a very large natural reverb.
Yeah.
It's almost too large, actually, for a string quartet, but it really did sound, it gave the music a fullness, a richness. There was another problem there that they didn't anticipate, which was since they had last been there to record, the area had become a lot more populated.
Okay.
So we had to deal with the sounds of cars and buses. And if you listen carefully to the recordings there, you will occasionally hear a bus pulling away from a stop sign at a quiet moment.
Oh, you can hear that.
Yeah, one of the ensembles, speaking of composer in residence, I had several years with a group in Iowa City called Red Cedar Chamber Music. This is quite recently. First worked with them in 2015 and then did more work 2019 and 20, and then a little bit after that as well. Started off being a quartet that was violin, flute, cello, and classical guitar. And the reason I got that gig is because they were looking for people who knew how to write for the classical guitar. So I was commissioned to write entr'acte music for a poem that was written in 1860 by a young woman called Curfew Must Not Ring Tonight.
Really? That's the name.
And then later the group would change to just the violinist and the cellist, who then hired other people, and we did some work with them for in a cathedral. that had a very rich sound. So sometimes can
Yeah.
be really helpful to the sound.
You mentioned earlier about winning the Emmy for
Yeah.
Outstanding Achievement in Music. Dying with Dignity was the documentary.
Right.
And that was,
That was a chamber orchestra score
okay.
also. Yeah.
What year was that? I was trying to think.
Let me think.
It was,
That was trying to place that. Yeah, somewhere around 92, 93, somewhere in there.
that was
Oh,
what?
no, wait, I take it back. It's 88.
Okay, in the 80s.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
With Colleen Dewhurst. Yeah,
yes,
it's the main character. And
yeah.
wow, well, how'd that make you feel winning the Emmy there?
Oh, it's an awesome feeling to get any recognition in this business. It is a wonderful feeling,
Right.
This one particularly awesome because, as one of my friends told me afterward, the Emmy winning composer will be something that follows you around from this point forward.
Right. You become stigmatized by that in a good way. Yeah.
Helps to open some doors.
That there you go. There you go. Very much, very, very true. And then we talked about your Parents' Choice Gold Award and
Yeah,
for two together an American folk music suite
right.
as well as that. So those are, yeah, some feathers in your cap there.
That was recorded in Prague.
Okay.
That was the one with That Piece Media that I mentioned earlier. So it's a little bit of interesting story there. I had the idea of doing an album with them that I would record with real instruments in Prague. And by the time they came up with a concept and okayed the budget, I had 30 days to write an hour of music.
Oh, yeah.
And that's a significant amount of pressure, which could easily be stifling and fortunately for me, I had to just get out of my own way and let it flow.
Okay.
And I feel blessed that it did. I ended up writing six pieces for different 4, 5, 6-piece chamber ensembles, and then an orchestral overture and an orchestral finale.
Okay. Have you noticed any difference in audiences around the world? You know, how certain audiences not receptive is not the word, but how they listen to and get caught up in the music versus others, or
That's an interesting question. I think quite the contrary. I think the appreciation of art music and openness to new ideas in an art form that has such a long tradition as classical music uh, is a kind of a universal demographic. So that I find that people who show up to a new music concert knowing they're going to be hearing ideas that are sort of experimental in a sense, that they then become part of the experiment to see whether something has a life beyond its first performance. That there is a kind of universality in the kind of people that are interested in that.
well, that would make sense because I think music is universal, so that would fall right in line with that. Yes. So, are you anything currently in the works?
Yeah, I have this new relationship with the musicians in Philadelphia. So I have I'm writing more music for them.
During COVID, did you write quite a bit?
Let me think about that. I would say not quite a bit, but some.
Okay.
I find I need to stay writing in order to feel solid about why I'm on the planet.
Yes.
What am I doing here?
Right.
The valuation of a musical artist has gone through an awful lot of changes since the 60s when I really began to work. There was a time at which I think that music was really leading the culture in many ways. And I think that's not as true, particularly right now. I think it's not as true, but I also think that the music of all kinds helps to keep our humanity alive. And so it's important. It's a responsibility, I think, of musical artists to keep that alive, even when they don't feel this kind of support from the culture, or when it appears there's so many other things of vital, immediate importance that bothering with something like chamber music is it's kind of beside the point.
Well,
Yeah,
it's your contribution, is what it is.
yeah, yeah,
And once a musician, always a musician. I've heard that.
yeah.
I've had artists, heard our artists step away for a while, but then they usually come back to it. It's once it's inside you, it's got to come out. So
So one story I haven't told you, I don't know if it would be
oh,
of interest,
please do.
about my my wife, my
Yeah.
relationship with my wife. Um, so we worked together for 4 years when we were the Pleasure Fair and before. I always admired her during that time. She had a boyfriend during that time. I had a girlfriend who was not in the group. At the time the group broke up, I had broken up with my girlfriend. And Michelle and I had a very brief relationship at that point in time. Then we all went our separate ways. Michelle went off on a tour of industrial shows, where she was acting and singing, which turned
Yes.
out to be her strength. She did leading roles in Broadway musicals, and she did a lot of acting and so forth. So I married somebody named Pepper, and as I mentioned, she went on the dating game, and she ended up marrying Murray Roman. They made a baby together, and 15 days after she had the baby, Murray Roman was in an automobile accident, was in a coma for 5 months, and then passed away. So that was the first I had read about her since the group broke up, which was like 4 or 5 years at that point. So I tried to find her because I wanted to express my sympathy, and I couldn't find her. There was no Facebook at the time, no email for me anyway at that point in time. And then in 2011, which was the year I had my first premiere with Shumei, that organization I told you about, I got an email from an English music historian named Malcolm Searles. He was writing a book about bread, And he needed to get in touch with all of the members of the pleasure fair to put together, the history
Yeah.
of bread. And he was the one that found Michelle.
Oh, did he? Okay.
And so Michelle ended up showing up at the premiere of the first piece I wrote for Chimay. It's a piece called Sea Change for Pierrot Ensemble. And she was married to Lou Shaw, who was a very successful TV writer and producer. And we were loosely in touch from that point forward. And Lou died in 2014. And in 2016, I got an email from Michelle saying we should get together and have lunch. I didn't get back to her until late January of the following year. We made a lunch appointment, and I showed up at the front door, and she opened the door. I had this feeling, overwhelming attraction for her. So we've been together since then.
It's that time. Wow. So all things do come to those who wait. Yeah. 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 Isn't that something? What a story. That's what I enjoy about doing these, is hearing those kind of stories too. Yeah. The happy ending ones too, as well.
It's very interesting that you're uncovering this history, because there's so much detail, complexity of interesting stuff under the surface of what goes on in human behavior and in the arts,
Right.
To bring it to the surface like this is very valuable.
I agree, and that's something in doing these that I've come to appreciate too. This just the stories, and like you said, making it personable. I've done some written interviews, but the time it takes a lot of times to send the questions out and get them the responses back, maybe months. Yeah. And it's not spontaneous. It's not of the moment like this.
Yeah.
And so this is what I've come to really enjoy, is doing this. And it's going to be there, for future generations.
Yeah. It makes me a little nervous.
No, there's nothing to be nervous about.
Basically, I like open conversations that just roll along and people have a chance to, and this is unique to have a chance to talk about all of that is
yes,
quite unique for me.
Anything on the horizon, or anything else, Stephen, you'd like to share? Or
that the funny thing about this business, that anytime you ask me that question, unless there's something, I mean, I have this one project that I'm working on, which is writing more for the Philadelphia ensemble. But, often just don't know what's coming next. That's part of the adventure of doing this. And there's certainly are problems with it in terms of survival at times. There's also excitement of adventure and constantly, challenging oneself to remain focused, to feel the purpose of making a contribution. One of the little things that I've picked up along the way is to think about that it's when I complete a piece of music and I'm looking for a performance, I am offering something, not asking for something.
There you go. I like that. And I think that's what true music should be about. I think any creative artist or art as well, any kind of art, is offering it up, not looking for anything in return. It's this is your offer to humanity and to all of us.
It brings one more thing to mind that I haven't mentioned, that's always been a very important current in my work and my thoughts about my work and with my students. I've done a fair amount of teaching, by the way, along the way. And that is, I think any artist, be it, but I'm thinking particularly of like a composer, an author, a painter, a sculptor, somebody who works by themselves and needs to continue to be productive, sometimes on demand, sometimes without demand, and without an obvious inspiration. One needs to have a creative process that they can depend on. And that in itself is a separate focus, a separate study, if you will, from the techniques of the art itself. The things that I've learned about creative process are not directly related to harmony, counterpoint, orchestration, form and analysis, any of those things that composers traditionally study. But it's equally important because otherwise the artist is constantly stuck with, how do I start? What do I do next? How do I know whether this is the best that I can do? How do I end this thing? Etc. There's a constant, we live in a constant series of painful questions. And one needs a process to deal with them. It doesn't answer the question so much as it gives you a way of dealing with them and that maintains a forward motion. And if I were in charge of a music department in college or any art department, I would make a course in creative process to be an essential part of it.
I think that's very much an important part, what you were just talking about. And of course, you being the creator, you're your own worst critic, right?
Yeah.
You know, but that's what makes you better too. You know.
Well, that's where, that's where the intellectual honesty comes in.
Right.
You have to start by being honest with yourself. And that means being an artist to me means that you're striving for perfection in your art.
Yeah.
And even though you may never actually reach it, you have to have a process that both keeps you striving for it, but also keeps you in motion in being productive.
That's right. And then getting the response from the audience and the listener and the fan just makes it complete. Yeah, it makes it well, I'm doing something right, you know.
When they're good responses.
That's right. That's right. Exactly right. You know, that's what really makes it all worthwhile. Yeah.
On my first string quartet that was premiered by the Arditi Quartet at Bing Theater, first really major exposure that I had, I got one devastating review, and I got one really good review. The good review was in the Times. The devastating review, can't remember. It was the paper, not as much, with a smaller circulation than the Times. The very nature of art, both in the creation and the response to it, is subjective.
Yes.
So that's one of the things that somebody who wants to be an artist has to deal with. No matter what you intend or how much you believe in what you've done, it's still the reactions to it are going to be subjective.
That's right. That's right.
Including from the person who's paying you to do the work.
Right. Exactly. That's the nature. You're right. You're right. And an artist is naturally sensitive, so that's going to
Yeah,
be something that you have to deal with, yeah, as well.
yeah.
Yeah, overreacting or not, so
The
yeah,
blessing and the curse of being
yes,
sensitive
that's
enough to do it. And that same sensitivity keeps a lot of people from doing it. It's just too painful, you know.
right, right. You said it right there. All right, well, Stephen, it's been very enjoyable. I'm glad you know what I say is I'm glad you took this leap of faith to do this, to come out here and be on the video and talk and share and all this.
Again, you know, I first of all, I really appreciate being included.
Oh yeah,
And it does feel good to kind of document whatever part I've played in the history of this period that we're talking about, and whatever the contribution, whatever it might have, how it ever may have benefited
yeah.
people. And I really appreciate what you're doing.
And I think one thing that you referenced too, you talk about is like talking about this, certain memories will be sparked that maybe I hadn't thought of that in a while. You know, I
Yeah,
wasn't planning on talking about that, but this kind of brought that to mind. So it's always a good thing, I think, to be able to talk openly like this. Like
absolutely.
yeah,
Very important for me to review this stuff for myself as well.
yeah. Yes. Well, I do appreciate it, Stephen, and I will get you a copy of this once I edit. Shouldn't be a whole lot to edit. Uh, and then you can post it, on your social
Ah,
media, on your website, wherever you'd like.
thank you again so much.
All right, you're very welcome, Stephen. And we'll be talking to you soon, all right?
Good. Looking forward to that.